The steel-gray sky loomed over the plains as Yates Everett drew his worn revolver, the weapon as cold and unyielding as the man who wielded it. 3 outlaws stood before him, their hands hovering near their holsters, but Yates had seen too many men like them to feel anything but contempt. "Last chance to ride away," Yates said, his voice a low rumble that carried across the wind-swept terrain of 1875 Wyoming. The tallest outlaw spat on the ground, clearly unimpressed by the solitary figure before him. "3 against 1, mister. Those odds ain't in your favor." Yates didn't blink. "Never said they were." When the shooting stopped, 3 bodies lay in the dust, and Yates Everett stood alone as he had for the past 8 years. He holstered his gun with practiced efficiency, mounted his chestnut stallion, and continued his journey toward the town of Bitter Creek, leaving the dead men for the buzzards that were already circling overhead. The life of a bounty hunter suited Yates. No attachments, no disappointments, and no one to mourn him when his luck inevitably ran out. At 36, his face was weathered by sun and hardship, his dark hair streaked with premature gray, and his eyes, once a warm hazel, now resembled the flint he used to start his campfires. People said he had been different once, before the war, before his family's murder, before he'd buried his heart alongside his wife and son. Bitter Creek appeared on the horizon as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie. It was a typical frontier town. A main street lined with wooden buildings, a saloon, a general store, a small church, and houses scattered around the perimeter. Yates had been here before, passing through on his endless quest for bounties and the temporary peace that came with each collection. The saloon was his first stop, as it always was. Not for the whiskey, though he would have a glass, but for information. Bounty notices were typically posted there, and barkeeps often knew which outlaws had been seen in the area. As he pushed through the swinging doors, conversations dimmed, and eyes turned to assess the newcomer. Yates ignored the stares, walking directly to the bar. "Whiskey," he said, placing a coin on the worn wooden surface. The barkeep, a portly man with an impressive mustache, nodded and poured the amber liquid. "Passing through?" he asked, the standard question for strangers. "Depends," Yates replied, tossing back the drink in one swallow. "Any work around here?" The barkeep leaned closer. "Sheriff's got a notice up for the Dalton gang. Been raiding homesteads north of here. $500 for the lot of them." Yates nodded, considering. The Daltons were notorious but not impossible to track. "Any other news worth knowing?" "New doctor in town," the barkeep offered. "A woman, if you can believe it. Set up practice last month in old Doc Miller's place after he passed." A female doctor was unusual, but Yates had no interest in town gossip. He was about to ask for another whiskey when the saloon doors burst open. A young man, barely out of his teens, stumbled in, his face pale with panic. "Help!" he cried. "They've taken my sister. The Daltons, they've got Hannah." The sheriff, who had been playing cards in the corner, stood quickly. "When, boy?" "Where?" "Our homestead, about 3 miles north." "Not an hour ago," the young man's voice broke. "They said they'd kill her if anyone followed," the sheriff cursed under his breath. "Those Daltons are getting bolder. I'll gather some men, but it'll take time." Yates remained silent, watching the scene unfold. Another woman in danger, another family torn apart. It was the way of the frontier, harsh and unforgiving. He had learned long ago that getting involved only led to more pain. And yet, as the young man collapsed into a chair, sobbing about his sister being their only family, something stirred within Yates, an echo of the man he once was, perhaps. He drained his second whiskey and stood. "I'll go," he said, his voice cutting through the commotion. The sheriff turned, surprised. "Alone? That's suicide, stranger." "Already heading that way," Yates replied, adjusting his gun belt. "Might as well make it worth my while." The young man looked up, hope dawning on his tear-streaked face. "You'll save Hannah. She's all I have left." Yates didn't promise anything. Promises were dangerous things, too easily broken. Instead, he simply nodded and headed for the door. "Wait," the sheriff called. "At least take this." He handed Yates a deputy's badge. "Might give you some authority." Yates pocketed the badge without pinning it on. Authority came from the barrel of a gun out here, not a piece of metal. As he mounted his horse, the sheriff provided directions to the homestead, and Yates set off, the sun beginning its descent behind the mountains. The Dalton gang had a hideout in the foothills, according to local rumors. If they had taken the girl there, she faced a grim fate. Yates pushed his horse harder, a forgotten urgency driving him forward. The homestead came into view just as dusk was settling, a modest cabin with a small barn, smoke still rising from a chimney. Signs of struggle were evident. Overturned furniture, a broken window, and blood on the porch steps. Yates dismounted, rifle in hand, and carefully approached. Inside, the cabin told the story of the attack. Dishes were shattered on the floor, a chair was splintered against a wall, and more blood stained a colorful rag rug. But something else caught Yates's eye, a small leather-bound medical journal, its pages filled with neat handwriting. The sister, Hannah, must be the new doctor in town. A doctor, someone who healed, who saved lives. The opposite of what Yates had become. He found tracks leading away from the homestead, 5 horses heading northwest toward the foothills. Night was falling, but Yates knew waiting until morning would only decrease the girl's chances of survival. He mounted up and followed the trail, his stallion sure-footed even in the growing darkness. Hours later, a small light flickered between the trees ahead. Yates dismounted and approached on foot, his movements silent from years of hunting men who didn't want to be found. The Dalton hideout was a crude cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping, with a small corral containing several horses. 2 men stood guard outside, rifles cradled in their arms, while sounds of laughter and crude jokes emanated from within. Yates surveyed the situation, calculating his approach. A frontal assault would be suicide, but he had no interest in waiting for reinforcements that might arrive too late. He circled around to the back of the cabin, where a small window offered a view inside. 4 men were visible, passing a bottle around a rough wooden table. A woman sat in the corner, her hands bound in front of her, her dark hair falling across her face. She wore a simple blue dress, now torn and dirty, but her posture remained straight, her chin lifted in defiance. When one of the men approached her with the bottle, she turned her face away. "Come on, lady doctor," the man slurred. "Have a drink with us. We're being real hospitable, ain't we, boys?" "I'd rather die of thirst," came the clear, unwavering reply. The man grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her to look at him. "That can be arranged, but not before we have some fun." Something cold and lethal settled in Yates's chest as he watched. He'd seen many cruel acts in his years as a bounty hunter, had tracked men who committed unspeakable crimes, but watching this woman's courage in the face of such threat awakened something he thought long dead. Moving back to the front of the cabin, Yates made his decision. He would create a distraction, draw the guards away, then deal with the men inside. It was a risky plan, but he had little choice. He retreated to where his horse waited, took a stick of dynamite from his saddlebag, a tool he rarely used but occasionally found necessary, and moved to a position opposite the cabin. Lighting the fuse, he threw it toward a stand of trees away from the building and waited. The explosion shattered the night silence. As expected, the 2 guards outside rushed toward the sound, weapons ready. Yates moved swiftly, approaching them from behind. The first man fell without a sound. a knife between his ribs. The second turned at the noise of his companion's fall, but Yates's revolver cracked before he could shout a warning. Inside the cabin, voices raised in alarm. Yates positioned himself beside the door, counting footsteps as they approached. When the door swung open, he struck, driving the butt of his gun into the first man's temple. The second outlaw managed to fire a wild shot before Yates's bullet found his chest. 2 left inside, plus the woman. Yates kicked the door fully open, diving to the side as gunfire erupted from within. Rolling to his feet, he fired twice in rapid succession. 1 bullet found its mark. A cry of pain followed. The remaining Dalton, presumably the leader, backed away, using the bound woman as a shield, his gun pressed to her temple. "Drop it," the outlaw snarled, "or the lady doctor gets a third eye." Yates remained in a half-crouch, his revolver steady. "You're a dead man either way, Dalton. Question is whether you die quick or slow." "I mean it." The man's voice rose in panic as he tightened his grip on the woman. For the first time, Yates got a clear look at her face. She was younger than he expected, perhaps late 20s, with striking features framed by dark hair. But it was her eyes that caught him, deep brown and utterly fearless as they met his across the room. She didn't plead or tremble. Instead, she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Understanding flowed between them in that moment. Yates adjusted his aim fractionally. "Last chance to surrender," he said to Dalton. "Go to hell," the outlaw spat. "You first." When the woman suddenly drove her elbow backward into her captor's stomach, Yates was ready. His bullet grazed her shoulder but buried itself in Dalton's throat. Both of them fell, but only the outlaw lay still. Yates crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside the woman. "You're hit," he said, noting the blood seeping through her sleeve. "Just a graze," she replied, her voice steady despite her ordeal. "I've treated worse on myself." She held up her bound hands, and Yates cut the ropes with his knife. "You're the doctor," he said, not a question. "Hannah Hammond," she confirmed, pressing a hand to her bleeding shoulder. "And you are Yates Everett." He helped her to her feet. "Your brother sent me." Relief washed over her face. "Jacob's alive, thank God. When they came, I told him to run and hide." Yates nodded. "He made it to town. Sheriff's probably gathered a posse by now, but they'll be too late." He gestured to the bodies around them. "The Daltons won't be troubling anyone anymore." Hannah looked at the dead men without flinching. "Good." She moved to a basin of water in the corner, tearing a strip from her petticoat to clean her wound. "Would you mind?" she asked, indicating her shoulder. Yates hesitated, then stepped forward. It had been years since he'd touched a woman, and the prospect made him uncomfortable. But Hannah's practical demeanor steadied him as he helped her clean and bind the graze. "You have experience with wounds," she observed as he tied off the bandage. "Seen my share," he replied shortly. "Can you ride?" "Yes." She stood, swaying slightly before regaining her composure. "I'd like to go home now, Mr. Everett." They found a horse for Hannah in the corral, and Yates helped her mount, noting the wince of pain she tried to hide. Dawn was breaking as they rode away from the hideout, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Neither spoke much during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts. As the homestead came into view, Hannah broke the silence. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not many men would have come after me alone." Yates shrugged. "It was on my way." "No, it wasn't." Her eyes, clear and direct, met his again. "But I'm grateful nonetheless." Before Yates could respond, a shout came from the direction of the cabin. Jacob was running toward them, tears streaming down his face. Hannah dismounted and embraced her brother, her own composure finally cracking as she held him close. Yates remained on his horse, watching the reunion with an odd feeling in his chest. This was why he avoided entanglements. They reminded him too much of what he'd lost, of the family he'd failed to protect. "You should have that wound properly cleaned," he said when Hannah looked up at him. "Infection sets in quick out here." "I'm aware, Mr. Everett. I am a doctor, after all." A small smile touched her lips. "Perhaps you'd allow me to thank you properly. A meal, at least, before you continue on your way." Yates hesitated. His instinct was to refuse, to ride away as he always did. But something about Hannah Hammond, her courage, her calm in the face of danger, intrigued him in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Just until the sheriff arrives," he conceded finally. "He'll want to report on the Daltons." Hannah nodded, her smile widening slightly. "Of course, just until then." Yates dismounted and followed the siblings into the cabin, telling himself he was staying only long enough to collect the bounty on the Dalton gang. But as he watched Hannah move about the kitchen, confident despite her injury, he suspected this brief stop might become more significant than he intended. And for the first time in 8 long years, the thought didn't immediately fill him with dread. The homestead was in disarray, but Hannah set about restoring order with the efficiency of someone accustomed to crises. She directed Jacob to fetch water and wood, then began sweeping up broken crockery while Yates awkwardly stood in the doorway. "There's coffee," she said, gesturing to a pot on the stove that had somehow survived the attack. "Help yourself." Yates poured a cup, watching as Hannah worked. Despite her ordeal and injury, her movements were methodical and purposeful. When she winced while reaching for a shelf, he found himself stepping forward. "Let me," he said, taking the broom from her hands. "You should rest that shoulder." She looked surprised but relinquished the broom. "Thank you. I suppose I should practice what I preach to my patients." She sank into a chair at the kitchen table. "Speaking of which, I should examine your hand." Yates glanced down, noticing for the first time the gash across his knuckles, likely from the fight at the cabin. "It's nothing. Infected nothing can kill a man as surely as a bullet." Hannah's tone was matter of fact. "Please sit. Consider it professional courtesy." Reluctantly, Yates sat across from her, allowing her to take his hand in hers. Her touch was clinical but gentle as she examined the wound. Up close, he noticed details he'd missed before. The faint freckles across her nose, the small scar on her chin, the way her dark hair curled slightly at her temples. "How does a woman become a doctor out here?" he asked, more to distract himself from her proximity than out of genuine curiosity. Hannah didn't look up from his hand. "The same way a man does. Study, practice, determination." She reached for her medical bag, which Jacob had retrieved from where it had been flung during the attack. "I trained in Boston under Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. Have you heard of her?" Yates shook his head. "First woman to receive a medical degree in the United States. A pioneer." Hannah cleaned his wound with surprising gentleness. "When my father died 2 years ago, Jacob and I decided to head west. He wanted adventure and I wanted to practice where I was needed most." "And were you needed?" A shadow crossed her face. "Not at first. People were skeptical, a female doctor, barely 30 with no husband in sight. But then influenza swept through last winter." She wrapped a clean bandage around his hand. "After that, most folks decided they cared more about staying alive than about who was doing the saving." Jacob returned with firewood, interrupting their conversation. "Sheriff's coming," he announced, peering out the window. "Looks like he's brought half the town with him." Indeed, a group of riders was approaching the homestead, led by the sheriff Yates had met in the saloon. Hannah rose to greet them, but not before giving Yates a look that seemed to contain both gratitude and something more complex. The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. The sheriff took Yates's report about the Daltons, confirming that the bounty would be paid once the bodies were recovered. Townspeople helped clean up the homestead, women bringing food and men repairing the broken window and door. Throughout it all, Hannah moved with quiet authority, thanking helpers and directing efforts while tending to her own injury when she thought no one was watching. Yates remained on the periphery, uncomfortable with the crowd and the attention his actions had garnered. He had done what needed doing, nothing more, yet people kept slapping his back and calling him a hero. By mid-afternoon, he was itching to leave, to return to the solitude he had grown accustomed to over the years. As the sheriff and most of the townspeople began to depart, Yates approached Hannah, who was standing on the porch, finally taking a moment's rest. "I should be moving on," he said, his hat in his hands. "Sheriff says I can collect the bounty in town tomorrow." Hannah studied him, her eyes tired but still observant. "You're welcome to stay here tonight, Mr. Everett. It's getting late, and the ride to town would be dark." Yates glanced at the setting sun. She was right, but the thought of spending the night in this home with its reminders of family and normalcy made him uneasy. "I've made camp in worse conditions," he replied. "I'm sure you have. But you don't need to, not tonight." Her voice softened. "Please. After what you did for us, the least we can offer is a proper meal and a roof." Before he could respond, Jacob joined them on the porch. "You're staying, right, Mr. Everett? I want to hear more about how you tracked down those Daltons." Caught between the eager young man and his quietly insistent sister, Yates found himself nodding. "Just for tonight." Jacob's face lit up, and even Hannah smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face and sent an unexpected jolt through Yates's chest. It had been a long time since he'd caused anyone to smile like that. Dinner was a simple affair. Venison stew that one of the townswomen had brought, fresh bread and coffee. Jacob dominated the conversation, peppering Yates with questions about his life as a bounty hunter, most of which Yates deflected or answered with minimal detail. Hannah said little, but Yates was acutely aware of her attention, the way her eyes followed the conversation, missing nothing. After the meal, Jacob reluctantly went to bed at his sister's insistence, leaving Yates and Hannah alone by the fireplace. A silence settled between them, not entirely uncomfortable but laden with unasked questions. "You don't talk much about yourself," Hannah observed finally, her fingers busy with some mending. Yates stared into the fire. "Not much to tell. I doubt that's true." When he didn't respond, she continued, "The way you handled those outlaws, the way you move, the look in your eyes, you've seen things most men haven't. Most men are better off for it." Hannah set her sewing aside. "Were you a soldier? In the war?" Yates nodded once. "Confederate cavalry." "Not something I'm proud of now. War makes difficult choices for everyone." Her voice held no judgment. "And after?" He should have shut the conversation down, as he usually did when people pried. Instead, to his own surprise, he found himself answering. "Came home to Texas to find my farm burned, my wife and son buried in the yard." The words were flat, rehearsed from the countless times he'd repeated them in his head. Neighbors said it was deserters, looking for food and money. Hannah's intake of breath was soft but audible. "I'm sorry." "Long time ago now. And you've been hunting bounties ever since. Alone. It suits me." Yates stood, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I should turn in. Long ride tomorrow." Hannah rose as well, but instead of heading to her own room, she stepped closer to him. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I know it wasn't easy." For a moment they stood facing each other, the firelight casting flickering shadows across her face. Yates was suddenly, acutely aware of her as a woman, not just a doctor or someone he had rescued, but a woman with depth in her eyes and strength in her bearing. It was a dangerous awareness, one he hadn't felt in nearly a decade. "Good night, Mr. Everett," she said finally, stepping back. Yates, he corrected, the word escaping before he could think better of it. Just Yates. A small smile touched her lips. Good night, Yates, sleep well. As he lay on the cot in the small room off the kitchen, Yates stared at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a home at night. The settling of logs in the fireplace, the creak of floorboards as Hannah moved in her room, the distant hoot of an owl outside. It had been so long since he'd slept under a roof that wasn't a hotel or saloon, so long since he'd shared a meal at a family table. He told himself it was merely the novelty that kept him awake, not the woman sleeping a few yards away or the unexpected comfort he'd found in her presence. By morning he would be gone, back to the life he knew, the solitude he had chosen. It was better that way, safer. But as sleep finally claimed him, Yates couldn't quite silence the treacherous voice in his mind that whispered, what if it wasn't? Morning arrived with the smell of coffee and bacon, pulling Yates from a surprisingly deep sleep. For a disorienting moment, he didn't recognize his surroundings, reaching instinctively for the revolver he always kept within arm's reach. Then memory returned. The Hammond homestead, the Dalton gang, Hannah's quiet strength. He rose, splashed water on his face from the basin in the corner, and stepped into the kitchen. Hannah stood at the stove, her back to him, humming softly as she worked. Sunlight streamed through the recently repaired window, catching in her hair and revealing auburn highlights he hadn't noticed before. "Good morning," she said without turning. "Coffee's hot." "How'd you know I was there?" Yates asked, somewhat disconcerted by her awareness. Now she did turn, a small smile playing at her lips. "Floorboard creaks, and you have a distinctive tread, deliberate, measured." She gestured to the table. "Sit. Breakfast is almost ready." Yates poured himself coffee and sat, watching as Hannah efficiently served up plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. There was no sign of Jacob. "Your brother's still asleep. Gone to check the traps. He's determined to be the man of the house." Affection colored her voice. "He's a good boy, just young. Too young for all the responsibility he feels." "How old?" 17. She sat across from him, her own coffee cradled between her hands. "Our parents died within a year of each other, mother from consumption, father from pneumonia. I was already practicing medicine by then, so Jacob came with me when I decided to head west. Must have been hard on him." Hannah nodded. "On both of us, but we manage." She studied him over the rim of her cup. "What about you? Do you have any family left? A sister in St. Louis?" "We write occasionally." Yates hadn't seen Margaret in years, though her letters found him now and then, forwarded from town to town as he moved across the frontier. "She remarried after the war, has children now. But you've never visited." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the personal nature of the conversation. "Best for everyone that way." "Is it?" Hannah's question was gentle but direct. "Or is it just easier?" Before Yates could respond, not that he had an answer ready, the door opened and Jacob burst in, his face flushed with excitement. "2 rabbits in the traps," he announced, holding up his prize. "And I saw deer tracks by the creek." "Well done," Hannah said, rising to take the rabbits. "We'll have them for dinner." Yates seized the opportunity to change the subject. "I should head to town, collect that bounty." Jacob's face fell. "You're leaving already?" "Just to town," Yates said, then added without planning to, "I'll be back before dark." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Hannah, whose eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't intended to return, had been planning to collect his money and move on as he always did. Yet something about this place, these people, made him hesitate to leave. "I thought perhaps." He continued awkwardly. "That is, if you're amenable, I could help repair some of the damage to the homestead." Hannah's expression softened. "That would be very kind. We'd be grateful for the help." Jacob was more enthusiastic. Could you show me how to shoot, too? I tried to fight those Daltons off, but I wasn't very good at it. Jacob, Hannah admonished. Mr. Everett isn't here to, I don't mind, Yates interrupted, surprised again by his own words. Boy your age should know how to handle a firearm properly, for protection. Hannah looked like she wanted to object, but finally nodded. I suppose you're right. Just be careful, both of you. Yates finished his breakfast and prepared to leave for town, an odd feeling settling in his chest. He was extending his stay, offering help, agreeing to teach the boy to shoot all things he wouldn't have considered 2 days ago. All because of a woman doctor who hadn't flinched in the face of danger, who looked at him not with fear or pity but with a clear-eyed understanding that was both unsettling and compelling. As he mounted his horse, Hannah came out to the porch. Town can be a temptation, she said, her tone light but her eyes serious. Saloons, card games, women. No one would blame you if you decided not to come back. Yates understood what she was offering, an easy out, a way to return to his solitary existence without guilt or explanation. It would be the sensible choice, the safe choice. I'll be back before sunset, he said firmly. That's a promise. Something shifted in Hannah's expression, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of trust. I'll hold you to it then. As Yates rode toward town, he questioned his own decisions. One woman's courage and kindness shouldn't be enough to alter the course he'd set for himself years ago. Yet he found himself calculating what supplies they might need for repairs, planning what he would teach Jacob about firearms, thinking about returning to the homestead rather than moving on to the next bounty. It was dangerous, this tentative connection. Dangerous and foolish. But for the first time in 8 years, Yates found himself willing to take the risk. Bitter Creek was bustling when Yates arrived, the main street filled with wagons, riders, and pedestrians going about their business. He headed straight for the sheriff's office, eager to collect the bounty and return to the Hammond homestead before he could change his mind. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Blackburn, looked up from his desk as Yates entered. Well, if it ain't our Dalton killer. Got the bodies early this morning. Mean bunch of sons of bitches, if you'll pardon my French. Bounty? Yates asked simply, not interested in small talk. Blackburn opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of bills. 500 as promised. County's grateful, mister. Those Daltons were getting bold, hitting homesteads closer and closer to town. Yates pocketed the money with a nod of thanks. As he turned to leave, the sheriff spoke again. Hear you're staying out at the Hammond place. Yates paused. For now. Good. Miss Hannah's a fine woman, does good work around here, but that place is too isolated for a woman and a boy alone. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. Been trying to convince her to move into town, but she's stubborn. Says her patients can't always come to her, so she needs to be able to go to them. Sounds like her, Yates commented before he could stop himself. Blackburn's eyes narrowed slightly. Known her long, have you? No. Yates shifted uncomfortably. Just passing through. The sheriff didn't look convinced. Well, whatever your plans, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep an eye on that place for a while. Daltons might be gone, but there's always someone looking to take advantage of an unprotected homestead. Yates nodded noncommittally and left, unsettled by the conversation. The sheriff's implication that Hannah needed protection grated on him, not because it was untrue the frontier was dangerous for everyone, especially women alone, but because it suggested a responsibility Yates wasn't sure he wanted to assume. He headed to the general store next, purchasing supplies for the repairs. Nails, hinges, a pane of glass for the broken window, and some basic foodstuffs to contribute to the Hammond's pantry. As the storekeeper wrapped his purchases, Yates found himself adding a small bag of peppermint candies to his order, remembering how Jacob's eyes had lingered on the candy jars during their brief conversation about town. It was a small gesture, insignificant really, but it had been so long since Yates had thought to give anyone a gift that the action felt momentous. The storekeeper, however, merely nodded and added the candies to his packages without comment. With his business concluded, Yates considered stopping at the saloon for a drink, his usual habit when in town. The thought of whiskey was tempting, but the memory of Hannah's words about town temptations made him hesitate. Instead, he secured his purchases to his saddle and prepared to head back to the homestead. As he was mounting his horse, a voice called his name. Turning, he saw a young woman approaching, her clothing and manner marking her as one of the saloon girls. "Mr. Everett," she said, a practiced smile on her painted lips. "I'm Rosie, from the Golden Nugget." She gestured toward the saloon. "Some of the girls and I wanted to thank you personal-like for taking care of those Daltons. They were rough with us last time they came through." Yates tipped his hat politely but remained mounted. "No need for thanks, miss. Just doing my job. Well, if you're interested in some company later." She let the invitation hang in the air between them. "Appreciate the offer," Yates said, his voice neutral, "but I've got other obligations." Rosie's smile turned knowing. "With the lady doctor, I hear. Can't blame you there. She's a handsome woman, even if she is a bit standoffish." She stepped back with a small wave. "Offer stands if you change your mind." Yates nodded and urged his horse forward, anxious to leave town and its complications behind. The exchange with Rosie had left him strangely unsettled. Not because of the invitation itself, he had received similar offers in towns across the frontier, but because of the assumption about his relationship with Hannah. Was that how it appeared to others? That he had some claim on her, or she on him? The thought should have alarmed him, sent him riding in the opposite direction. Instead, he found himself spurring his horse faster toward the Hammond homestead, an unfamiliar anticipation building in his chest. True to his word, Yates returned to the homestead before sunset. As he approached, he saw Hannah hanging laundry on a line stretched between two posts, the white fabric snapping in the prairie wind. She turned at the sound of his horse, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. "You came back," she said as he dismounted, her tone suggesting she hadn't quite believed he would. "Said I would," Yates replied, unloading his purchases. "Got supplies for the repairs and some food." Hannah stepped forward to help, her hands brushing his as she took a package. "Thank you." "You didn't have to do that. Wanted to contribute." Jacob emerged from the barn, his face lighting up when he saw Yates. "You're back. Did you get the bounty? Are you still going to teach me to shoot?" "Jacob," Hannah chided, "at least let Mr. Everett catch his breath before you start badgering him." "It's all right," Yates said, reaching into his pocket. "Got something for you, boy." He handed over the bag of peppermint candies, feeling oddly self-conscious. Jacob's expression was worth any discomfort. "For me? Really?" He looked to his sister for permission, then eagerly opened the bag. "Thank you, sir. Remember your manners," Hannah reminded him, but her eyes, when they met Yates's, were soft with gratitude. That was thoughtful. Yates shrugged, unused to such appreciation for small gestures. "Saw them at the store. Thought the boy might like them." "I do," Jacob confirmed around a mouthful of candy. "Can we practice shooting now?" Hannah laughed, the sound surprisingly melodic. "After dinner, Jacob." "Mr. Everett has been riding all day." "Yates," he corrected again. "And I don't mind. Still enough light for a quick lesson." With Hannah's reluctant permission, Yates took Jacob behind the barn with his revolver and a rifle he'd noticed mounted above the homestead's door. For the next hour, He taught the boy the basics of handling firearms, how to load, aim, and fire safely, the importance of respecting the weapon's power, and strategies for conserving ammunition. Jacob proved to be an attentive student, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by a serious desire to learn. By the time Hannah called them for dinner, the boy had managed to hit a row of cans Yates had set up on the fence line. "You're a natural," Yates told him, surprising himself with the easy praise. "Just need practice now." Jacob beamed at the compliment. "Will you teach me more tomorrow?" Yates hesitated, suddenly aware that he hadn't planned beyond today. "We'll see," he said noncommittally, though the boy's eager expression made something twist in his chest. Dinner was a more elaborate affair than breakfast. Roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and a cobbler made from preserved berries. Yates couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten so well 2 days in a row, and he said as much to Hannah. "I enjoy cooking when I have the time," she said, clearly pleased by his appreciation. "Between patience and maintaining the homestead, it's often just quick meals, but I wanted to," she broke off, color rising in her cheeks. "That is, I thought a proper dinner would be nice after your trip to town." The slight stumble in her usually composed demeanor intrigued Yates. Was she nervous? The thought that he might affect her composure was both unsettling and oddly satisfying. After dinner, as Jacob cleared the table, Hannah turned to Yates. "How long do you plan to stay?" She asked directly, her practical nature asserting itself. "Not that you're not welcome, but I imagine a man in your line of work has obligations elsewhere." It was the question Yates had been avoiding asking himself. "No current bounties pressing," he said carefully. "Could stay a few days, help with those repairs, if that suits you." "It does," Hannah replied, perhaps a bit too quickly. "We're grateful for the help." Their eyes met across the table, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that his stay was about more than repairs or gratitude. Before either could speak further, Jacob interrupted with questions about the next day's shooting lesson, and the moment dissolved into practical planning for the following day's work. Later, as Yates lay on the cot that was rapidly becoming familiar, he confronted the strange reality of his situation. He, who had avoided attachments for 8 years, was voluntarily extending his time with the Hammonds. He, who trusted no one, had promised to teach a boy to shoot. He, who had hardened his heart against all softness, found himself thinking about Hannah's smile as she'd thanked him for the supplies. It was madness, surely. Yet as he drifted toward sleep, Yates couldn't summon the will to fight against it. Not yet. Not while the memory of Hannah's face in the firelight was still so clear in his mind. The days that followed fell into an unexpected pattern. Mornings were spent on repairs, fixing the broken door, replacing the shattered window pane, mending furniture that had been damaged in the attack. Afternoons often included shooting practice for Jacob, who improved rapidly under Yates's tutelage, or hunting to replenish the Hammond's meat stores. Evenings brought shared meals, conversations by the fire, and an increasing sense of comfort that Yates found both welcome and terrifying. Hannah continued her medical practice, sometimes riding out to distant homesteads when patients couldn't come to her, other times receiving them in the small room off the kitchen that served as her examining area. Yates was impressed by her skill and dedication, the way she approached each ailment with calm efficiency, whether it was a child's fever or a rancher's broken arm. On the 4th day of his stay, Yates accompanied Hannah on a call to a homestead where a woman was in difficult labor. He waited outside with the anxious husband, uncomfortable with the sounds of pain coming from within. "She'll be all right," he found himself assuring the man. "Dr. Hammond knows what she's doing." The man, a young farmer named Ellis, looked at him gratefully. "Folks say she's a miracle worker." When the midwife couldn't help, I thought for sure I'd lose Maggie and the baby both. Hours later, when Hannah emerged, tired but triumphant, with news of a healthy boy and mother, the look of pure joy on Ellis's face stirred something long buried in Yates's memory. The day his own son had been born, the overwhelming pride and terror he had felt holding that tiny life in his rough hands. On the ride back to the Hammond homestead, Yates was quieter than usual, lost in memories he'd spent years trying to forget. Hannah, perceptive as always, noticed his mood. "Difficult births always affect me that way," she said as their horses walked side by side. The precipice between life and death, the fragility of it all. Yates nodded, grateful that she had misinterpreted his silence. "You handled it well, steady under pressure." "I've had practice." She glanced at him. "Not unlike you, I imagine." "Different circumstances, but the same need for calm in crisis. Difference is you create life, I take it." Hannah considered this. "Is that how you see your work, taking life?" Yates shrugged. "It's what it is. Men with bounties aren't usually the type to come quietly. But the men you hunt have chosen their path. They've harmed others, broken laws." Her voice was thoughtful, not judgmental. "In a way, you're protecting life too." It was a perspective Yates had never considered, a more noble interpretation of the violent work he'd chosen. He wasn't sure he deserved such a generous view, but Hannah's words eased something in him nonetheless. As they neared the homestead, Hannah spoke again. "Jacob admires you greatly, you know. I haven't seen him this enthusiastic about anything since before our parents died." Yates shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Boy needs a man's influence at his age. Nothing special about me." "I disagree." Hannah's voice was quiet but firm. "There's a great deal special about you, Yates Everett, though you seem determined not to acknowledge it." Before he could respond to this unexpected assessment, they arrived at the homestead to find Jacob waiting anxiously on the porch. The moment for private conversation passed, but Hannah's words lingered in Yates's mind throughout the evening. The next day brought an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Blackburn, riding up to the homestead just as Yates was finishing repairs on the barn roof. The lawman nodded in greeting, his expression serious. "Got news," he said without preamble after dismounting. "Russell gang's been spotted headed this way from the north. 3 brothers, mean as snakes and twice as poisonous. Robbed a bank in Cheyenne, killed 2 guards." Yates climbed down from the roof, wiping his hands on his trousers. "What brings them this direction?" "Rumor has it they're meeting associates somewhere near Bitter Creek. Thought you might be interested, given your line of work. There's a substantial bounty on them." The implication was clear. Here was Yates's excuse to leave, to return to the life he knew. A week ago, he would have jumped at the opportunity, already calculating the best tracking routes and planning his approach. Now he found himself glancing toward the house, where Hannah was visible through the window, examining a patient's arm. "Appreciate the information," he said neutrally. "I'll consider it." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly. "Thought you'd be more eager. $5,000 for the 3 of them, dead or alive." It was indeed a substantial sum, enough to sustain Yates for months. Yet the thought of leaving the Hammond homestead, of returning to his solitary existence tracking violent men across the frontier, suddenly held less appeal than it once had. "Like I said, I'll consider it," Yates repeated more firmly. Sheriff Blackburn studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Suit yourself. Just thought you should know." He remounted his horse. "Tell Dr. Hammond I said hello." After the sheriff departed, Yates remained standing in the yard, conflict roiling within him. The Russell gang represented everything he'd dedicated his life to for the past 8 years. Justice for the lawless, payment for his skills, purpose in a purposeless existence. Yet the thought of leaving this place, these people, created an almost physical ache in his chest. When had the Hammond homestead begun to feel like something dangerously close to home, Hannah found him there as dusk approached, still lost in thought. "Jacob said the sheriff visited," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Trouble." Yates explained about the Russell gang, watching her face carefully as he mentioned the bounty. "I see," she said when he finished, her expression carefully neutral. "Will you go after them?" "Haven't decided." Hannah nodded, her eyes on the distant horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple. "You should know that, whatever you decide, you'll always be welcome here. If you go and return, or if you stay, or even if you leave and don't come back for a very long time." The generosity of this statement, the lack of pressure or expectation, struck Yates deeply. In that moment, looking at Hannah's profile against the sunset, he realized with sudden clarity that he was falling in love with her, had perhaps been falling since that first moment in the Dalton cabin, when she'd met his eyes without fear. The realization should have terrified him, sent him running for his horse and the open road. Instead, it settled in his chest with an unexpected rightness, as if a puzzle piece long missing had finally found its place. "Hannah," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Before he could continue, Jacob came running from the barn, excited about a new litter of kittens he'd discovered. The moment shattered, but the realization remained, burning in Yates's mind like a brand. He loved Hannah Hammond with her courage and compassion, her steadiness and strength. And for the first time in 8 years, he didn't want to run from what he felt. That night, as the household settled into sleep, Yates made his decision. He would stay, at least for now. The Russell gang could be someone else's bounty. He had found something here more valuable than money, more healing than vengeance. The beginning of a second chance he'd never thought to seek. Morning brought rain, a steady downpour that transformed the yard into mud and kept them all indoors. Hannah attended to paperwork and correspondence related to her medical practice. Jacob read a book about exploration that Yates had brought him from town on his last visit. And Yates cleaned and maintained his weapons, a habit too ingrained to abandon even as his plans changed. By afternoon, the rain had lessened to a drizzle, and a knock at the door interrupted their quiet activities. Hannah answered to find a drenched young man, barely older than Jacob, panting and frantic. "Dr. Hammond," he gasped. "Pa's been shot. Men came to our place looking for something. Pa tried to run them off and they shot him. Ma sent me for you." Hannah immediately went into action, gathering her medical bag and instructing Jacob to prepare her horse. Yates stepped forward, a sense of foreboding building in his gut. "These men," he asked the boy, "how many?" "What did they look like?" "3 of them," the boy replied, wiping rain from his face. "Big men, rough-looking. One had a scar across his cheek like this." He drew a line from his eye to his jaw. Yates and Hannah exchanged a glance. "The Russell gang." "I'm coming with you," Yates said, his tone brooking no argument. "Jacob, stay here. Bar the door and don't open it for anyone but us." The ride to the Thompson homestead was tense and difficult, the rain-soaked trails slowing their progress. The young man, whose name was Sam, led them to a small farm about 5 miles east of the Hammond place. As they approached, Yates noticed signs of trouble. The barn door hanging off its hinges, a window broken in the main house, a chicken coop overturned. "Stay behind me," he instructed Hannah as they dismounted. Could be they're still around. But the Russells had apparently moved on. Inside the house, they found Mrs. Thompson kneeling beside her husband on a blood-soaked mattress in the main room. The man was pale and still, a gunshot wound in his upper chest oozing dark blood. Hannah immediately took charge, kneeling beside the injured man and opening her medical bag. "How long ago was he shot?" she asked Mrs. Thompson. "About 2 hours," the woman replied, her face strained with worry. "I tried to stop the bleeding like you taught in that lecture at the church, but it keeps coming." "You did well," Hannah assured her, examining the wound. "The bullet's still inside. I'll need to remove it." She looked up at Yates. "I'll need your help. Are you squeamish?" Yates shook his head. "Seen worse. Caused worse." For the next hour, Yates assisted as Hannah worked to save Thompson's life, holding instruments, providing light, helping to restrain the man when pain broke through his semi-conscious state. Despite the grim circumstances, Yates found himself impressed by Hannah's skill and focus, the way her hands remained steady even as sweat beaded on her brow. When the bullet was finally extracted and the wound cleaned and bandaged, Hannah sat back on her heels, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "He'll live with proper care and no infection," she told Mrs. Thompson. "But he needs watching day and night for the next 2 days." "I'll stay," Yates found himself offering, "in case those men come back." Hannah looked up at him, surprise and something warmer flickering in her eyes. "What about the bounty, the Russells?" "Some things are more important," he replied simply, and they were. As he stood watch that night while Hannah caught a few hours' sleep in a chair by Thompson's bed, Yates reflected on how much had changed in just over a week. The man who had ridden into Bitter Creek, cold and alone, would never have put a farmer's safety above a lucrative bounty. That man had seen only targets and rewards, not people worth protecting at his own expense. But Hannah Hammond had changed that, had changed him, with her unwavering courage and compassion. She had reminded him what it felt like to care, to connect, to consider more than his own solitary path. When morning came, Thompson was conscious and stable enough for Hannah to return to her own homestead to check on Jacob. Yates remained behind, promising to send word if the Russells returned or if Thompson's condition worsened, as he helped Mrs. Thompson with chores around the farm, keeping his rifle close at hand. Yates realized he was making a choice that would alter the course of his life. If he stayed in this area, became involved with these people and their problems, he couldn't continue as he had been. A bounty hunter couldn't put down roots, form attachments, think of others before the hunt. Yet the prospect of giving up that life, of becoming something else, a protector rather than an avenger, perhaps didn't fill him with the dread he would have expected. Instead, there was a cautious hope, a sense of possibility he hadn't allowed himself to feel in nearly a decade. Hannah returned in the afternoon, bringing Jacob, who had refused to be left behind again, and food for the Thompsons. She checked on her patient, pronounced him improving, and prepared a list of instructions for Mrs. Thompson. "Yates has offered to stay another night," she told the grateful woman, "and I'll return tomorrow to check the wound." As they prepared to leave, Jacob helping Sam with evening chores while Hannah packed her medical supplies, Yates pulled her aside. "There's something I need to say," he began awkwardly, unused to initiating personal conversations. "About the Russells and what happens after." Hannah looked up at him, her expression guarded but hopeful. "Yes, I've been thinking about staying in the area." The words came haltingly, each one a step away from his old life and toward an uncertain new one. Not as a bounty hunter, maybe as something else. "What would that something else be?" Hannah asked softly. Yates ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by his inability to express what he felt. "I don't rightly know yet, but I do know I want to be near you and Jacob, if you'll have me." The slow smile that spread across Hannah's face was like sunrise after the longest night. "I think we'd like that very much," she said, her voice steady but her eyes bright with emotion. "Both of us." Before Yates could respond, A shout from outside shattered the moment. Jacob burst through the door, his young face pale with fear. Riders coming, 3 men armed, the Russells had returned. Yates immediately took charge, positioning Jacob and Sam with the women in the back bedroom with Thompson, giving the boys his spare revolver with strict instructions to use it only if the men broke through to them. He and Hannah would confront the outlaws, try to convince them to move on without further violence. They're looking for something, Yates reasoned as he checked his weapons. If we can find out what, maybe we can negotiate. Hannah nodded, her face set in determined lines. The medical bag stays with me. If there's more shooting, they'll need a doctor. Yates wanted to argue, to insist she take shelter with the others, but the look in her eyes stopped him. This was who she was, a healer who would not hide while others faced danger. It was part of why he loved her. "Stay behind me," was all he said. "And if shooting starts, get down." The Russell gang arrived with the swagger of men accustomed to taking what they wanted through force and intimidation. 3 large men on powerful horses, faces weathered by outdoor living and violence, each heavily armed. The leader, bearing the scar Sam had described, dismounted and approached the house. Yates stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but not raised. "This property's under protection," he called. "State your business." The scarred man stopped, assessing the lone figure before him. Well. If it ain't Yates Everett, long way from Texas, ain't you?" Yates stiffened, surprised at being recognized. "Do I know you? You killed my cousin in Abilene 2 years back, Billy Harding." The man spat to one side. "I'm Marcus Russell. These are my brothers, Luke and John." The connection clicked into place in Yates's mind. Billy Harding had been a stagecoach robber with a reputation for unnecessary cruelty to passengers. The bounty had been substantial, the hunt challenging. "Harding chose his path," Yates replied evenly. "As did you, apparently. Bank in Cheyenne." Russell laughed, an ugly sound. "Got yourself a reputation, Everett. Cold as ice, they say. Man who tracks alone and never misses." His eyes narrowed. "Though I hear you've gone soft lately, playing house with a lady doctor." The taunt was designed to provoke, to make Yates act rashly. Once it might have worked. Now, with Hannah standing just inside the door, he remained calm. "What do you want here, Russell? Thompsons have nothing worth taking." "That's where you're wrong." Russell gestured to the farmhouse. "Old man Thompson used to ride with us years back. Went straight, got himself a wife, tried to forget his past. But he held on to something that belongs to us, a map to a gold cache we hid after a job in '69. We've come to collect." Behind him, Yates heard Hannah's soft intake of breath. This was unexpected. Thompson, the simple farmer with an outlaw past, but it explained why the Russells had tracked him specifically. "He's in no condition to tell you anything," Yates said. "You saw to that when you shot him." "That was unfortunate," Russell agreed without sincerity. "But we're reasonable men. Give us the map and we'll ride away peaceable like. No one else needs to get hurt." It was a lie, of course. Men like the Russells didn't leave witnesses, especially not with a bounty on their heads. If Yates gave them what they wanted, everyone in the house would likely be dead before nightfall. "Let me talk to Thompson," he stalled. "See if he knows where this map is." Russell's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You trying to play us, Everett?" "Because I'm starting to think we should just kill you all and tear the place apart ourselves. That would be unwise." Hannah stepped onto the porch beside Yates, her medical bag in hand. "Mr. Thompson is my patient, and I won't allow any further harm to come to him." Yates wanted to pull her back inside, away from danger, but her presence was oddly steadying. The Russells wouldn't expect a woman to stand her ground this way, which might give them a momentary advantage. "Well, ain't this sweet?" Russell sneered. "The bounty hunter and the lady doctor." "Heard about you too, madam. Quite the reputation for saving lives." His hand moved to his gun. "Let's see if you can save your own." What happened next unfolded with the strange clarity that Yates had experienced in many dangerous situations. As Russell drew his weapon, Hannah flung her medical bag directly at his face, startling him and disrupting his aim. Simultaneously, Yates fired his rifle, striking the outlaw in the shoulder and spinning him backward. The other Russell brothers opened fire, bullets splintering the porch railing as Yates pulled Hannah down behind a solid section of the porch. He returned fire, hearing a cry of pain as one of his shots found its mark. Inside, he shouted to Hannah, covering her as they crawled through the doorway. Once inside, Yates barricaded the door with a heavy sideboard while Hannah crawled to the window, peering cautiously around the frame. "One is down," she reported. "The other two are taking cover by the barn." Yates joined her at the window, assessing their situation. One Russell wounded but still dangerous, two others positioning for an assault on the house. Inside, two women, two boys, an injured man, and Hannah all his responsibility now. "Is there a back way out?" he asked Mrs. Thompson, who had emerged from the bedroom at the sound of gunfire, through the kitchen. "Leads to the vegetable garden." Yates formulated a plan quickly. "I'll draw their fire from the front. Hannah, take everyone out the back and head for the trees beyond the garden. Stay low, stay together." Hannah shook her head firmly. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone." "This isn't a debate," Yates said sharply. "Those people need you to lead them to safety. I need you to be safe." Something in his voice, the raw emotion behind the words, seemed to reach her. Hannah's expression softened, though her resolve remained firm. 10 minutes, she said. "If you're not with us in 10 minutes, I'm coming back." It wasn't the complete agreement he wanted, but it was the best he would get from a woman as determined as Hannah Hammond. Yates nodded once, then turned to the others to explain the plan. As Hannah led the Thompsons and the boys through the kitchen, Yates positioned himself at different windows, firing strategically to make the Russells believe multiple defenders were inside. It was a tactic he'd used before, one that might buy enough time for Hannah and the others to reach the safety of the trees. From his vantage point, he saw the moment they emerged from the back of the house, Hannah leading the way with Mrs. Thompson supporting her husband while the boys carried what supplies they could. They were halfway to the tree line when disaster struck. The third Russell brother, whom Yates had lost track of in the confusion, emerged from the side of the house, directly in their path. Yates watched in horror as the outlaw raised his rifle, aiming at the fleeing group. Without hesitation, Yates crashed through the front door, firing as he ran. His bullet caught Russell in the leg, causing his shot to go wide, but the distraction cost Yates his cover. A searing pain tore through his side as a bullet from one of the other brothers found its mark. He stumbled but remained upright, continuing to fire, determined to keep the outlaw's attention on him rather than the escaping group. Through a haze of pain, he saw Hannah and the others reach the trees, disappearing into their protective shadows. Relief surged through him, followed immediately by a cold recognition of his own vulnerability. He was wounded, outnumbered, and exposed. The odds, never good, had turned decisively against him. As he tried to make his way back toward the house, a second bullet caught him in the thigh, dropping him to one knee. The pain was immediate and intense, blurring his vision and weakening his grip on his rifle. "This is it," he thought with surprising clarity. "This is how Yates Everett ends, not in old age or peaceful sleep, but in blood and gunfire as he'd always expected." The only difference was that now it mattered. Now, there was someone who would mourn him, someone whose life would be diminished by his absence. The thought brought both comfort and regret. From his kneeling position, Yates raised his rifle for what he knew might be his final stand. If he was going to die, he'd make sure at least one more Russell went with him. "Drop it, Everett," called Marcus Russell, emerging from behind the barn, his wounded shoulder not preventing him from aiming his revolver steadily at Yates's head. "You're done." Yates didn't lower his weapon. "Might be," he agreed, his voice strained but defiant. "But I've got one more shot, and it's got your name on it." Russell's scarred face twisted in a cruel smile. "Always heard you were a hard man to kill. Let's test that theory." As Russell's finger tightened on the trigger, a shot rang out but not from his gun. The outlaw's expression changed to one of surprise, then emptiness, as he crumpled to the ground, a bullet hole precisely centered in his forehead. From the direction of the trees, Hannah emerged, Jacob's rifle in her hands, her face set in determined lines. Behind her, Jacob and Sam appeared, each armed with the pistols Yates had given them. The remaining Russell, seeing his brother fall and facing armed opponents from multiple directions, made the sensible choice. He dropped his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. Hannah rushed to Yates's side, her doctor's hands already assessing his wounds as Jacob and Sam kept their weapons trained on the surviving outlaw. "You came back," Yates said, his voice weak as blood loss and pain threatened to overwhelm him. "Of course I did," Hannah replied, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind his wounds. "I told you I would." "You shot him," Yates noted, a hint of wonder in his tone. "Perfect shot." A ghost of a smile touched Hannah's lips as she worked. "My father taught me to hunt when I was 12. Said a woman alone on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself." Her hands were gentle but efficient as she stemmed the bleeding from his side. "I've never had to use those skills on a person before." "You did what needed doing," Yates said, understanding the conflict that would come later when the immediacy of danger had passed. "You saved my life." "And I intend to keep doing so," Hannah replied firmly. "So don't you dare die on me, Yates Everett. Not now. Not when we've only just found each other." The fierceness in her voice gave Yates strength he didn't know he had. With her help, he managed to stand, leaning heavily on her as they made their way slowly back to the Thompson house. The next few days passed in a blur of pain and fever as Yates's body fought the trauma of his wounds. Hannah remained by his side, treating his injuries, monitoring for infection, and ensuring he took the medicines she prepared. In his more lucid moments, Yates was aware of her constant presence, the cool touch of her hand on his forehead, the quiet strength of her voice urging him to fight, to stay, to live. Sometimes, in the haze between wakefulness and delirium, he thought he heard her talking to him about the future, about healing, about building something together, about the possibility of love after so much loneliness. Whether these were dreams or reality, they anchored him, gave him a reason to push through the pain and weakness that threatened to pull him under. On the fourth day, Yates woke with a clear mind and diminished pain. Hannah was asleep in a chair beside his bed, her head at an uncomfortable angle, dark circles beneath her eyes testifying to her vigilance during his illness. Watching her, Yates was struck by the realization that this woman had not only saved his life, but had also, somehow, saved his soul. She had looked past the hardened exterior he presented to the world and seen the man he could be might still become, if given the chance. As if sensing his gaze, Hannah stirred and opened her eyes. Seeing him awake and alert, she smiled with genuine relief. "Welcome back," she said, moving to check his bandages. "You had me worried." "Takes more than a couple of bullets to kill me," Yates replied, though they both knew how close it had been. Hannah's hands were gentle as she examined his wounds. "The fever's broken and there's no sign of infection." You'll need time to regain your strength, but you should make a full recovery. Thanks to you, she shook her head. I just patched you up. You did the hard work of staying alive. Yates caught her hand as she finished rebandaging his side. Hannah, he said seriously, I need to ask you something. Her eyes met his, wary but hopeful. Yes. Before all this happened, I told you I was thinking about staying, about becoming something else. He took a deep breath, gathering courage for words he'd never thought to say again. I want to stay, with you and Jacob, if you'll have me. Hannah's expression softened, though she maintained her practical demeanor. In what capacity exactly? As our protector, our friend? As whatever you'll accept, Yates answered honestly, though I'd hope in time for more than friendship. A smile bloomed on Hannah's face, transforming her features from pretty to beautiful. I think, Mr. Everett, that time has already come and gone, at least for me. The implication of her words sent a surge of emotion through Yates so powerful it nearly took his breath away. Are you saying? I'm saying that a woman doesn't sit by a man's bedside for 4 days, barely sleeping or eating unless her feelings run rather deep, Hannah replied, a hint of her usual directness returning. I'm saying that I've come to care for you despite your determination to be uncared for, and I'm saying that, yes, I would very much like you to stay. Yates tugged gently on her hand, drawing her closer until she was sitting on the edge of the bed. I'm not an easy man to love, he warned her. 8 years alone leaves marks that don't fade quickly. I'm aware of your flaws, Yates, Hannah said with a small smile. Your stubbornness, your occasional recklessness, your tendency to assume the worst of situations and people. Her expression grew serious. But I've also seen your courage, your honor, your capacity for kindness even when you try to hide it. I've seen the man beneath the bounty hunter, and that's the man I want to know better. It was more than Yates had dared to hope for acceptance of who he was, flaws and all, coupled with belief in who he could become. The weight of loneliness he had carried for 8 years seemed to lift slightly, allowing him to breathe more freely than he had in a very long time. I love you, he said simply, the words rusty from disuse but no less sincere for it. Have for a while now, I think. Just took me time to recognize it. Hannah's eyes brightened with unshed tears. I love you too, she replied, her voice steady despite her emotion. Enough to take a chance on a bitter cowboy who spent too many years riding alone. Yates reached up to touch her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Not alone anymore, he promised. Not ever again, if I have any say in it. When their lips met, it was a beginning tentative at first, then growing in confidence and warmth. A kiss that spoke of past wounds healed and future possibilities embraced. A promise of partnership, of shared strength, of a love neither had expected to find. Later, as Hannah helped Yates to a chair by the window where he could watch the sunset, Jacob burst into the room, excited to see his mentor awake and improving. The boys' chatter about the aftermath of the Russell incident, how the sheriff had come to collect the surviving brother, how the Thompsons had decided to move into town after all, how everyone was talking about Dr. Hammond's perfect shot filled the room with youthful energy. Looking at Hannah and Jacob, Yates felt something he had thought forever lost to him, a sense of belonging, of home. Not in a place, but in people. In this woman who hadn't flinched in the face of danger, who had seen the good in him when he'd forgotten it existed. In this boy who looked at him with admiration and hope, who represented a future Yates had never allowed himself to imagine. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Yates Everett made a silent vow. To be worthy of this second chance, to protect and cherish the love he had found, to build a life that honored not only the family he had lost, but also the family he had unexpectedly gained. The bitter cowboy who had ridden alone for so long had finally found his way home, guided by the unwavering light of a woman who knew both his darkness and his potential. And in that light, he would learn to live again, not just survive, but truly live, with an open heart and the courage to love. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Yates Everett stood on the porch of the Hammond homestead, now his home as well, and watched as a wagon approached along the road from town. His wounds had healed completely, though the scars remained, new additions to the collection his body had accumulated over years of fighting and surviving. In the months since the confrontation with the Russell gang, Yates had established a new life for himself. He had turned in his bounty hunter's badge, using the reward money from the Russells to invest in the homestead. The barn was now expanded to house more horses, as Yates had started a small business breeding and training the animals, using skills he'd developed during his cavalry days. He also served as an unofficial deputy to Sheriff Blackburn when needed, helping to maintain order in and around Bitter Creek. It wasn't the constant danger and solitude of bounty hunting, but it satisfied his need to stand against lawlessness while allowing him to return each night to Hannah and Jacob. The approaching wagon contained Hannah, returning from town where she had attended a meeting at the church. The women of Bitter Creek had organized a committee to establish a proper clinic, with Hannah as the head physician. It was a significant step forward for the community and a recognition of Hannah's importance to the area. As she drew closer, Yates felt the now familiar warmth in his chest at the sight of her. At 36, Hannah Hammond was even more beautiful to him than when they'd first met, not just for her physical attributes, which he admired greatly, but for the strength, intelligence, and compassion that defined her. "You're smiling," Hannah observed as she pulled the wagon to a stop. "Should I be concerned?" Yates stepped forward to help her down, his hands lingering at her waist. "Can't a man smile when his wife returns home?" "Wife-to-be," Hannah corrected with a smile of her own. Their wedding was scheduled for the following weekend, a small ceremony at the church in town. "And yes, I suppose he can. It's just not an expression I was accustomed to seeing on your face when we first met." "I had less to smile about then," Yates replied, kissing her lightly before taking the parcels she handed down from the wagon. Together they walked toward the house, which had undergone significant improvements in recent months. A new wing had been added for Hannah's medical practice, allowing her to treat patients without them entering the family's living quarters. The main house had been expanded as well, with a larger kitchen and additional bedrooms in anticipation of a growing family. "How was the meeting?" Yates asked as they entered the kitchen, setting Hannah's purchases on the table. "Productive." "The committee approved the budget for medical supplies, and Mr. Ellis has offered to donate lumber for the clinic building." Hannah removed her bonnet, hanging it on a peg by the door. "And Mrs. Blackburn announced that she's expecting again, which created quite a stir." "Good news all around then," Yates commented, pouring coffee for both of them. "Jacob's still at school?" "Yes, though he should be home soon." Hannah's expression grew thoughtful. "Mr. Peterson asked if he might apprentice Jacob next summer, says he shows a real aptitude for carpentry." Yates nodded, pleased but not surprised. In recent months, Jacob had blossomed, his natural intelligence and curiosity finding outlets in various skills and interests. The frightened boy who had burst into the saloon seeking help for his sister had grown into a confident young man with promising prospects. "He'll make a fine carpenter if that's what he wants," Yates said, "though I still think he has a doctor's hands. Steady, precise." Hannah smiled at this assessment. "Like his sister, you mean? Like both of you. It's in the blood." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, drinking their coffee and enjoying the peaceful interlude. Such moments had become precious to Yates, who had spent so many years alone with only his thoughts for company. The simple pleasure of sharing quiet time with someone he loved still struck him as miraculous at times. "I had a letter from Margaret today," he said eventually, referring to his sister in St. Louis. "She and Robert will be arriving for the wedding, bringing the children too." Hannah's face lit up. "That's wonderful. I've been looking forward to meeting them." The reunion with his sister had been another step in Yates's healing process. After 8 years of minimal contact, he had written to Margaret about Hannah, about his new life, about his desire to reconnect with the family he had distanced himself from in his grief. Her response had been immediate and joyful, full of forgiveness for his years of absence and enthusiasm about his upcoming marriage. "She'll like you," Yates said confidently. "Probably more than she likes me, truth be told." Hannah laughed, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I doubt that very much. From her letters, it's clear she adores her big brother, even when he's being stubborn." "Especially then," Yates agreed with a wry smile. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps on the porch. Jacob burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement. "Yates, Hannah, the sheriff's deputized me for the festival security detail. I'll get to wear a badge and everything." Hannah raised an eyebrow at Yates, who shrugged innocently. "Sheriff's idea," he claimed. "Boy's old enough for some responsibility." "I'm almost 18, Jacob added, as if this settled the matter. Hannah shook her head, but her expression was indulgent. "Just remember that being deputized is a serious responsibility, not an excuse to show off for the Johnston girls." Jacob's blush confirmed that the Johnston girls, particularly the eldest, Sarah, had indeed been on his mind. Yates hid a smile, remembering his own youthful attempts to impress young women. As Jacob launched into details about his duties for the upcoming Harvest Festival, Yates leaned back in his chair, watching the animated conversation between brother and sister. This was his family now, not by blood, but by choice and love. The thought no longer frightened him as it once had. Later that evening, after Jacob had gone to meet friends in town and the household chores were complete, Yates and Hannah sat on the porch swing, enjoying the cool evening air. Hannah's head rested against Yates's shoulder, her hand in his, their fingers intertwined. "What are you thinking about?" she asked after a comfortable silence. "You have that contemplative look again." Yates squeezed her hand gently. "About how different things might have been if I hadn't stopped in Bitter Creek that day, if I hadn't offered to go after the Daltons. Do you regret it?" Hannah asked, though they both knew the answer. "Not for a moment," Yates replied honestly. "Best decision I ever made, even if I didn't know it at the time." Hannah shifted to look up at him, her expression serious. "You know, I've never properly thanked you for saving me that night." "You've thanked me plenty," Yates assured her. "Besides, you returned the favor with the Russells. That's not what I mean." Hannah's voice softened. "You saved me from more than just the Daltons, Yates. Before you came, I was not unhappy exactly, but incomplete. Dedicated to my work, to Jacob, but missing something essential." Her eyes, so expressive and direct, held his. "You filled a void in my life I hadn't fully acknowledged was there." The admission touched Yates deeply. Hannah was typically reserved about such personal feelings, preferring to express her love through actions rather than words. That she would speak so openly now was a gift he treasured. "Funny," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I was just thinking the same about you. For 8 years I was half a man, surviving but not living. You brought me back to life, Hannah, made me remember who I was before grief and revenge consumed me." "We healed each other then," Hannah said, leaning into his touch. We do," Yates corrected. "Every day." As the sun set over the prairie, casting long shadows across the land they had made their home. Yates Everett held his future in his arms and felt, at last, completely at peace. The bitter cowboy who had ridden alone for years had found not just warmth but love, purpose, and redemption in the woman who hadn't flinched from his darkness or his light. Together, they had built something neither had dared to hope for: a family, a home, a life filled with the promise of joy to balance the sorrows they had each endured. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Yates made a silent promise to cherish that gift for all the days they would share. For a man who had once believed his heart died with his first family, the capacity to love again was the greatest miracle of all, one he would never take for granted, and one for which he would be eternally grateful.